Welcome to this overview of the business of humanity approach to strategic management. My name is John Camillus, and it's my pleasure to share with you my perspectives on this emerging and responsive approach to the challenges faced by managers operating in the strategic arena today. To structure this discussion, the topics that I will address in sequence are: one, the context of strategic management, the challenges that are being faced by managers today. I'd like to talk about what the impact is on strategy of the new normal that is the context that business organizations, every organization indeed, finds itself today. And then go into addressing the fundamental reason why managers are needed, the existence of uncertainty. Uncertainty and complexity are the two reasons why managers are required in order to run an organization. Without that, a computer could do it. I suspect in the near future, computers will be able to handle the uncertainty and complexity that requires human judgment at the moment. We'll then feed into the business of humanity itself and talk about why it is relevant to the challenges we are facing today, and wrap up with some guidelines that we can derive from the business of humanity perspective in terms of ensuring sustainability on all three dimensions: economic, environmental, and social, to ensure that your organization, my organization, is around decades from today. Let's talk about the context of strategic management to start out with. And I'd like to take a long-term view of this, a 100-year view of this. I'd like to go back to Henry Beall, who wrote his first book on administration in French in the late 19th century, which was translated in 1918. The first English version of it, which I had access to, was published in 1918. And he talked about the fundamental processes of management, starting from planning through organizing, staffing, directing, implementing, and controlling. Planning and control for him were the beginning and the end of the management function. And this perspective undergirds, it's rational and undergirds, I think, the reality that we are facing even today. Now, in 1970, a very important thing happened. We had been recognizing for some time that there are very different kinds of managerial decisions. At one end, there are the regular operating decisions, and then there are other fundamental decisions that affect the total organization and ensure that it remains viable in the context of an uncertain and changing future. And we tended to call that strategic planning and strategy formulation. And it was a bunch of aphorisms and ideas that had been developed by people looking at actual case studies. We used to call it business policy when I did my MBA, which I admit was in medieval times. And it was a professor by the name of Kenneth Andrews at the Harvard Business School who put together all the ground rules, the kinds of thinking processes that had been suggested by looking at how effective managers such as Chester Barnard and Alfred Sloan had managed their organizations like AT&T and General Motors. And he developed and offered a framework which he presented in a book called The Concept of Corporate Strategy, which informed our thinking, and today also is critically important in terms of thinking about strategy and strategic management, which is the next development, which actually happened at the University of Pittsburgh at this business school, where there was a conference which looked at strategy and strategy practice. And the book that came out of it and the term that gained popularity as a consequence of it was the book called Strategic Management, which is a phrase which has become quite common today. But Schendel and Hofer, Dan Schendel and Chuck Hofer, actually suggested that strategy is best understood in the context of a larger framework of the organizational structure, the leadership style, the values of the organization, the planning and control systems, the human resource systems of the organization. So there's a larger context in which the concept of strategy was embedded, and it is necessary to understand this larger framework in order to carry out strategy formulation and implementation processes. In 2018, 100 years from Henry Fayol's seminal book in English version of the seminal book, Larry Fink in January. Larry Fink, as you know, is the CEO of BlackRock, invested over $1 trillion in companies, very, very significant investment firm. Larry Fink wrote a really important letter, sort of a watershed letter, a groundbreaking perspective in his letter to CEOs and governing boards in January of 2018, where he argued that he would not be investing in companies where there was no sense of purpose to guide the strategic directions of the organization. For him, an understanding of purpose, social purpose, was necessary in order to ensure the sustainability of the organization. This is an idea that had been promoted by CEOs, most notably Paul Pullman of Unilever, but it was really an earth-shaking kind of statement coming from an investment management firm. So we have this sequence from understanding the nitty-gritty of management to this perspective of the context in which management decisions need to be made, the notion of purpose being important. And you will have recognized so many books and articles, including the current issue of Harvard Business Review, as a notion of describes the importance of purpose for strategic sustainability. So this is a new era that we are emerging into, which Pullman and Fink and others have led us into, or at least recognize the reality of this new context in which purpose is a fundamental requirement for sustainability. But we need to go back and take a look at the perspectives that existed and have sustained us really for decades. And of course, you cannot ignore the economist perspective. Michael Porter, of course, and his 3 books which came out in the 80s, starting with Competitive Strategy, which was an industrial organizational perspective on the playing field in which organizations operate. But what he did was absolutely fascinating and brilliant. Industrial organization economics is usually looked at from a government policy point of view to level the playing field. He took the same concepts and developed a very simple and powerful framework, the 5 forces model, which all of us are familiar with, to essentially help organizations understand how to tilt the playing field in their favor, how to understand the competitive situation, how it will be evolving, and how the organization could, in a sense, gain a competitive advantage in this context. And the second book has the title Competitive Advantage, which is more of an internal look. And there, the brilliant suggestion approach that he came up with was the notion of a generic value chain, where the supporting activities became, to my mind, even more important than the primary activities. By tweaking the primary activities, you improve the existing strategy. The supporting activities, such as information technology, are the basis for transforming the organization to meet emerging challenges. I'm not going to spend time on the competitive advantage of nations, the powerful national diamond that he developed there. It was very appropriate for its time, but it's somewhat less relevant in today's global economy. But these first two books are extraordinarily powerful, and one cannot forget, in terms of the economist's contribution to strategic management, Milton Friedman's perspective, which essentially took the framework that Kenneth Andrews had suggested, that we analyze the internal context and the external context and develop strategy by melding the two in the context of top management's priorities and the priorities of the stakeholders. The very interesting thing is, given the economist's perspective, we had a strong IO perspective here, essentially a very structured, real value chain perspective here, which in a sense ignored some of the behavioral and social considerations in terms of understanding the environment and the organization itself. And perhaps the most powerful yet, I think, dysfunctional simplification was Milton Friedman's arguments which were used to justify a singular focus on profits and a singular focus on the shareholder. So this was the way we thought about strategy until I think a few years ago. And I'd like to show you why the economist perspective perhaps needs to be strengthened, modified, has certainly improved. The book that I'd recommend to you, which if you have a chance, at least read the introduction, was by this famous futurist Alvin Toffler, where he talked about future shock. And to summarize this perspective, if you go back 40,000 years when Homo sapiens emerged and took over for the Neanderthals, the human condition was one of subsistence, hunting, gathering, foraging, small groups, a brutal existence going from one place to another. With the emergence of agriculture, let's say 4,000 years ago, all this changed. The pyramids of Giza, the medieval European cathedrals, accountants, writing, culture, feudal society, the accumulation of wealth, people staying in one place, all of these things happened which changed the whole nature of the human condition, which was transformed again, so let's say 400 years ago, in terms of the Industrial Revolution. Pittsburgh exists, Sao Paulo exists, Birmingham exists, Calcutta exists because of the Industrial Revolution with all its advantages and enormous problems, the kinds of challenges in terms of urban living for the poor. It's really is the context that we need to recognize today, and which is the biggest challenge in terms of poverty and alienation and so many other issues that need to be addressed. But again, it led to great wealth and perhaps, unfortunately, aggregation of wealth in a very small portion of the population, but it changed the whole nature of the world until about, I'm going to say 40 years ago, it really is about 71 years ago, the emergence of the transistor changed the whole nation, the whole nature of the Industrial Revolution, and we have the Information Revolution now, and the world is utterly, utterly transformed because of this. The fall of the Soviet Union can be linked to the Information Revolution. What's going on today in the world, you can see the power of information and computers. And in fact, the point is that the major change that took place 40,000 years ago when Homo sapiens emerged, and the second change that took place when the Agricultural Revolution happened, the third change that took place when the Industrial Revolution happened, were all occurring faster and faster, 40,000, 4,000, 440. So really other significant changes have happened that are disrupting us. It could be the biotechnology revolution. It could be Kurzweil's singularity, where artificial intelligence and human intelligence get melded, or AI takes over. So these fundamental changes are transforming what organizations need to do in order to sustain themselves, and which leads to some fascinating perspectives. And there is a point of view here I'd like to share with you. This book, Quantum, by Manjit Kumar, which is the first of these books in this three-book sequence, makes a point I want you to recognize, which is important in terms of the business of humanity. If you search for truth in terms of understanding the world, like Einstein did, you're going to end up in a metaphysical level talking about God, such as the way Einstein did. God doesn't play dice with the universe perspective. But Niels Bohr, who was another great scientist, perhaps almost in the same level of contribution as Einstein, possibly, approaching that, the structure of the atom and so on. What for him, he was not searching for truth. He was searching for a way of understanding the context so that you could make decisions, so that you could simplify it in a powerful fashion, like Porter's 5 forces, to understand the competitive context. And essentially, that's what we plan to do in terms of the business of humanity paradigm that we'll be talking about. Simplify the world, but in a realistic fashion to enable human comprehension to operate in this extraordinarily uncertain, complex context. The fortune at the bottom of the pyramid by C.K. Prahalad changed our perspective. He identified the 3 or 4 billion people living on $1 to $4 a day, but who have $13 trillion of purchasing power, which has not been accessed effectively by the organized business sector. And in terms of accessing that, you need extraordinarily new business models and extraordinarily powerful disruptive technologies to access that. But it's something that organizations are doing now and are changing the whole concept of how one approaches strategic management. And then this piece by Courtney, Kirkland, and Viguerie, late 1990s Harvard Business Review, talked about the different kinds of uncertainty in very powerful ways, different from what we academics have been looking at. We're looking at state, effect, and response and so on. But they said there are very fundamentally different kinds of uncertainty. The kind of uncertainties the classic strategic models are designed to address is where there's a predictable point in the future with some volatility around it. Earnings per share can be projected to be $3 plus or minus 5 cents or 10 cents. The GDP is going to be 2.5% plus or minus 0.1% in either direction. The exchange rate is going to be such and such. So in that context, where you can predict a likely outcome, strategy development is relatively easy. But then they talked about multiple alternative futures, like the health system in the US, 17% of the economy. Nobody knows what it's going to be like in 2020, for example. It could be, there could be, the individual mandate could be removed. Maybe it's a single-payer system. There could be technological, biotechnology development that transform the whole arena. Societal mores could change in terms of care for the aged and so on. We have no idea what the health economy is going to look like a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. And the other perspective I want you to understand is what is the role of the manager? There's some rethinking going on about it. Is our sole responsibility of the managers and boards to the shareholder, or is there a larger societal responsibility? And Rakesh Khurana argues very powerfully that there originally was a notion of societal responsibility that sort of faded away but is being resuscitated now because of a variety of reasons and a variety of pressures. And the interesting thing, this is extraordinarily important, Michael Porter's article of creating shared value, where he saw all these challenges I've been talking about so far, not as difficulties, but as opportunities. And that's an extraordinarily powerful perspective, which is shared by the business of humanity. In fact, one can say it's very, very similar in its perspective. And the third book that I would recommend to you is Learning from the Future, as opposed to extrapolating the past, which is what we are inclined to do and know how to do. And that responds to the kinds of uncertainties that Courtney, Kirkland, and Viguerie talk about, which led to, for instance, I guess this is a seminal piece, looking at strategy as a wicked problem, where it's difficult to define the problem changes depending upon the solutions you adopt. There's no notion of what is the right answer. You don't know when you have the right answer. The problem has multiple tangled causes which cannot be separated. Unexpected contingencies and hazards will happen. Will inevitably occur, and there are multiple stakeholders with different priorities. You can see that happening whether it is in immigration or the notion of what the future of General Electric should be like. It's in that context, the traditional approaches to strategy development are, let me say, ineffective and possibly even dysfunctional. So we see these two streams of development, recognizing that there's a new normal that we need to address. And in terms of the impact of this new normal on strategy, one is understanding again what Schendel and Hofer talked about in strategic management. How does one integrate in a synergistic fashion the multiple subsystems in the organization, which are extraordinarily complex but still need to be melded effectively, and also then mesh this complex organization with the increasingly uncertain, ambiguous, volatile, chaotic indeed environment that we are facing in order to develop a strategy. So we have the challenge of developing a coherent strategic management system, strategy, structure, systems, and style. McKinsey adds 3 more: shared values or superordinate goals, staff, and skills to this 4S model. But at the very least, we need to look at these 4 S's in order to understand strategy, to create strategy, and to implement strategy. And essentially, the notion of strategy that I would recommend to you, there are so many ways of looking at strategy, but the fundamental concept which I'd like you to keep in mind as we work through the business of humanity approach is that strategy is a construct that essentially harmonizes, I like that word, harmonizes the organization and the environment, recognizing that not only the organization can be modified, transformed, manipulated if you want, but the environment too is something that you can change. Like Federal Express understood, they created the hub and spokes model for their operations, the logistics, but they also affected the environment by changing the Civil Aeronautics Board regulations and the US Postal Service regulations in order to create the space in which they could operate. So we are talking about an increasingly challenging task of fashioning an organization and fashioning an environment in the context of extreme complexity and uncertainty to create strategy that's powerful and sustainable. The other notion I would like you to recognize is that we have always taught in our strategy classes that we need to avoid what might be called the suicide corner, the bottom right-hand corner in this matrix, where you're entering a new business where new competencies are required. We used to say avoid that, and very often going global put you in a suicide corner. But essentially, people look for adjacencies. How can we use existing competencies to grow new businesses or add new competencies to existing businesses to improve our competitive strength? But today, in the world of disruption that we are facing, we need to know how, not only how to operate in the suicide corner, but to charge into the suicide corner and function in that very, very difficult context. So the notion of the suicide corner being shunned is no longer something that one can accept, because it's going to creep up on you even if you try to avoid it. So putting all this together, in terms of the strategy challenge, you can go to the bottom left-hand corner of this matrix and say, okay, we know how to deal with tame issues where the uncertainties in the nature of volatility and the causes of the uncertainty are distinct, separable causes that we can comprehend and deal with, and go to the, we also need in today's world to deal with wicked problems. I talked about them, where there's chaotic ambiguity is the nature of the uncertainty. And in terms of the complexity, the causes of the complexity are multiple and tangled and inextricable. They're all connected to each other. So this is the new normal that which we need to recognize when you're formulating strategy. And the traditional approaches are, as I said before, not particularly effective in the wicked problem context. So in terms of managing uncertainty, there's perspectives that are important, and there are techniques such as contingency planning, possibility scenarios, identifying robust actions that will work in multiple scenarios, using a real options mindset where one reserves the right to play, makes the investments needed to be in the game, and then when the situation clarifies and one understands which scenario is emerging, make the major investments. And finally, the notion, the cliche, when you can't, the best way of predicting the future when it's uncertain is to create it. That becomes a reality here. And transformational strategies that enable organizations to reach a desired and envisioned future is something we need to talk about. And this sequence is covered from the HBR article, Strategy Under Uncertainty, which I'd recommend to you, by Courtney, Kirkland, and Viguerie. The book Learning from the Future by Fahey and Randall, extraordinarily effective book, which gives you a whole bunch of techniques that you can use, especially scenario planning, to deal with the various kinds of uncertainty. And of course, the book Wicked Strategies that tries to put all these together into a coherent framework, and which in a sense addresses the right-hand upper extreme of the previous matrix, where you're dealing with great extreme complexity and great high degree of uncertainty at the same time. So the approach that the business of humanity adopts, which is the notion of which has been called wicked strategies, that approach, essentially, it takes the challenges that result from these three mega forces which I have identified, which capture all the other forces as subsets, in a sense, of this mega forces. The notion of the inevitability of globalization, the imperative of innovation, the importance of shared value. We put those together. The interactions create disruptive technologies when innovation and globalization meld. When innovation results in new business models, when you have multiple stakeholders, there are conflicted stakeholders, and when you have globalization, the complexity of globalization, and multiple stakeholders with different priorities, you get unknowable futures. Nobody knows what's going to happen in Syria tomorrow. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the West Bank and Palestine and Israel 2 years from now. Nobody knows what's going to happen in terms of the Indo-Pakistani relationship, the Indian-Pakistan relationship in, let's say, the next few years. And nobody knows what's going to happen in the US in the next 2 to 3 years. So in that context, we end up with unknowable futures. The interaction of disruptive technologies, conflicted stakeholders, and unknowable futures create wicked problems. And the response to them is to actually embrace these challenges and make lemonade out of lemons, essentially do what a martial artist say, especially in the judo field, use the power and momentum of your opponent to essentially overcome the challenge that he or she presents. And essentially you take disruptive technologies and make new business models with them. You take conflicted stakeholders and bring them together to co-create value because they have perspectives that can add extraordinary new insights into how to approach the challenges. And of course, the notion of feed forward, where you work from the future backwards to what you do today. What do you do in order to enable this future to happen, as opposed to saying, given the past, this is what we expect to happen. Extrapolation of the past today is a highly suspect activity at best. So the notion of wicked strategies accepts these challenges that organizations face and embraces them as opportunities in terms of creating new business models, in terms of co-creating value, and in terms of feed forward that creates the organization and the context that one might envision or desire. So there's an important perspective here that is necessary in order to handle uncertainty. We need some touchstones, some beacons that transcend disruptions. Whatever happens in these unknowable futures, we still need something that gives us a basis for decision making that transcends these disruptions. We are looking for what is core, enduring, and distinctive about the organization, which gives us, again, the criteria for strategy formulation and strategy evaluation. And what's core about the organization are its values. What's enduring about the organization are its aspirations. What is distinctive about the organizations are the competencies it possesses. And essentially, these core, enduring, and distinctive characteristics of the organization can be called its identity. In fact, the term identity in the context of people essentially has the same characteristics. It's core to you, it's enduring, and it makes you distinctive. So the notion of identity is a very powerful construct that is necessary to handle the disruptions that we are facing. So having looked at this, let's look at the business of humanity in terms of our understanding of what is necessary to manage in this context of extreme uncertainty and great complexity. And the business of humanity paradigm was developed not in isolation, but looking at a whole bunch of innovative organizations doing some extremely interesting things, addressing the challenges we have been talking about. So based on these case studies, analysis, discussions, and of course the theoretical frameworks that are available, the book Wicked Strategies, sorry, I should go back. I should go back here a second, because essentially what we had before I go to the wicked strategies notion was this notion of strategic management systems, which I see myself as Forrest Gump. I'm old, I've been there, just happened to be there at the time when the strategic management perspective emerged. And my 1986 book on strategic planning and management control was one of the few that actually addressed the issue of a strategic management system, the organizational structure, the planning and control systems, the kind of leadership characteristics that are necessary in order to formulate strategy. It put it together in terms of strategy, structure, systems, and style of the organization. And that was a powerful contribution, I'd like to think, in the 1980s, 1990s. But in the reality that exists today, the notion of wicked strategies responding to wicked problems was captured in this book, Wicked Strategies. And what I'd like to talk about is using this wicked strategies perspective, one can offer an alternative paradigm and very clear-cut guidelines for developing strategies that will respond to the emerging business and organizational context. Essentially capturing the synergy of economic value and social benefit, which Porter also argues are totally mutually beneficial and mutually enhancing. The business of humanity proposition is very simple. We developed this some years ago, and the notion is that strategic decision making that employs criteria falling under the rubric of humanity, the word humanity is important, in its two dimensions. If you look at Webster, there are two dimensions of humanity. One is humaneness, and the second is humankind. And basically, humaneness means doing things which are socially and responsible and humane. And the second, I'm sorry, that's tautologous. But the second notion, responding to humankind, not necessarily making narrow distinctions of this subsegment is what we will address, and only this, leads to superior economic performance and enduring value. So essentially using humanity as a lens through which to formulate strategy, employing the criteria of humaneness to evaluate alternatives, and recognizing humankind as a stimulus, a catalyst for thinking of strategic alternatives would really contribute to enhanced economic performance and to sustainability. The rationale for the BOH proposition, one is that if you look at humaneness, it is been demonstrated that criteria such characteristics such as quality, safety, environmental sustainability, social sustainability, diversity, gender equality, integrity, ergonomics, good design, all of these have positive effects on the bottom line. There is research to demonstrate the importance of each of these and the positive impact that they have on the bottom line. The second notion I'll just mention again, C.K. Prahalad's fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. But the very interesting thing is, apart from the $13 trillion of purchasing capacity that can be accessed with creative strategies, there's the notion that innovation is also stimulated when one addresses the bottom of the pyramid. Clayton Christensen, the guru of disruptive innovation, disruptive technologies, accepts this. In fact, he goes so far as to say the only way to develop disruptive technologies is to address the needs of people at the bottom of the pyramid, especially, of course, in emerging economies. And the other notion is when you look at two very different markets, there is globalization from the developed market to the emerging market, but importantly, and GE is explicitly trying to tap into this power, there's reverse innovation, because when one meets the price point pressures of these emerging markets, disruptive technologies are developed which can then be taken back to gain competitive advantage in the developed markets. And you put these together, one can make the argument humaneness and humankind are lenses through which one can develop alternative strategies with the humankind lens and evaluate strategies through the humaneness lens to gain sustainability, economic, environmental, and social. So just put this together in a slide which shows the various points we've been talking about, just integrating it and essentially arguing that the notion of humankind stimulates alternatives, and humaneness is a powerful lens that can be used to evaluate the alternatives. Finally, putting all these together, the business of humanity model puts all of these together, and it's been reinforced by recent developments. I mean, Larry Fink, whom I mentioned earlier, we quoted him here to say, a company's ability to manage environmental, social, and governance matters demonstrates the leadership and good governance that's so essential to sustainable growth, which is why we are increasingly integrating these issues into our investment process. For Larry Fink to say that is extraordinarily powerful. It's like St. Paul on the road to Damascus having that epiphany. Paul Polman has been on this line of thought for quite some time, and he articulated what is the basis for I think one can argue the business of humanity proposition and book that exists, which says, why don't we develop a business model aimed at contributing to society and the environment instead of taking away from them? So the business of humanity proposition and strategies essentially tries to accomplish what Paul Polman talks about in terms of corporate purpose. There is a notion here that's important. You can talk about using existing strategies, the kind of notion that Warren Buffett promotes, where he takes an existing business and manages it well. That could be, for instance, you can, if you're making Lamborghinis, you can modify them for the conditions in emerging markets marginally, maybe more responsiveness to heat or ability to handle, to survive the humidity and temperature conditions in some of the developing economies. You sell the Lamborghinis to the apex of the pyramid, the wealthy people that exist, the small number of wealthy people that exist in developing countries, and essentially make profits which can then be fed into further innovation of Lamborghinis. That's the classic approach that one can argue Warren Buffett's moated business, where there's a moat protecting the business like a castle, is what you focus on in order to ensure sustainability. But then you can have the Elon Musk perspective, which is how does one innovate in order to be sustainable and grow? And there, for instance, you start with the notion of what is at the bottom of the pyramid, what are the needs. It could be water, like General Electric has identified, which is going to grow into a $50 billion business very soon, I think. Essentially, you develop the technologies and the innovation to meet the price point needs, like they've done in the medical system, the EKGs in India, the ultrasound in China, which then essentially can come back to the developed economies, but also in the process essentially benefits a vast number and variety of stakeholders in the emerging economies and the developed economies, which promotes, again, more creativity in terms of the needs that can be met. The ability to do both is what we are talking about, is necessary in today's world. And essentially, I won't go through this again. The notion of the business of humanity is to take the strategic challenges and transform them into opportunities, creating new business models to handle disruptive technologies, co-creating value by engaging conflicted stakeholders, and using feed-forward models to create the future that you want to have happen in the context of unknowable futures. And that is the baseline thinking that undergirds the business of humanity, and the notion that one can gain added economic value by essentially addressing very basic social needs. And we will explore this notion in terms of actual business models in subsequent videos. Thank you, and I hope this has made some inroads into your thinking in terms of how to engage in the practice of strategic management. Thank you.